It's my pleasure to introduce tonight our moderator, Mr. Charles Solomon.
Thank you, sir. Good evening, and it is now my pleasant duty to introduce our panelists. First, another Charles, this one Berolzheimer, who is the president and CEO of California Cedar Products, the leading manufacturer of wooden pencils, who brought us back the Blackwing iconic pencil, and also a jazz fan and baritone, I understand. We have the grandson of the Oscar-winning director in whose name we are all gathered, Craig Kausen, president and CEO of Chuck Jones Companies and chairman of the board of trustees of the Chuck Jones Center for Creativity. I thought I'd just sit here. So just make, okay, make yourself comfortable. Well, don't take the chair without the mic. Okay. Story artist Jenny Lerew runs the blog The Blackwing Diaries and the Blackwing Sketchbook, and is currently at work at DreamWorks on Mr. Peabody and Sherman. And coming back on stage, presumably without his keyboards, is Christian Tamburr, who you were listening to before, who plays piano, trap set, and percussion, and has performed with not only his own quartet, but Dave Brubeck, Michael Feinstein, and Harry Connick Jr. We can't crack these panels out like sausages, you know. Now, I remember many years ago, Chuck Jones telling me that if you give someone reams and reams of paper and an infinite number or nearly infinite number of colored pencils, he will never accomplish anything because he will just sit and futz and experiment and try different colors against each other. Whereas if you give someone 100 sheets of paper and one pencil, he didn't specify a Blackwing, but that was what he always used, and I assume he had in mind. He said, then you'll be forced to put everything into those drawings because there won't be anything else to hide behind or anything to confuse you. So I'd like to begin by asking our panelists about the importance of tools and how they use them, and what tools do you use when you're creating? I mean, I myself am slave to the Post-it note, the legal tablet, and the odd piece of paper, wherever it may be, that's covered with little notes about what to do and things to remind myself to get or to do. And I realized that when I would go and take notes at a film that I would have to review, I often couldn't read what I had written, but there was something about the act of writing it down that would fix it in my memory. So I'm curious to know what memories and tool habits we all share. Now, don't everybody talk at once.
Ladies first.
Ladies first.
Right. Well, it's interesting. It's a kind of a difficult question to answer because I draw storyboards for feature animation, and there's been a big sea change in the tools that we use. It's very interesting. About 7 years ago, everything started to go digital, and we still draw. We still draw just the way I would draw with my Blackwing on a pad of story paper, but now we draw on a Cintiq, which is a large tablet, and you can manipulate with a stylus, like a pen, that is pressure sensitive, and it's kind of a beautiful thing. It's sort of like drawing with a Sumi ink brush, or you can adjust the settings for what you're drawing with to look like a pencil, to ape a China marker, to ape something like a Blackwing, but it is digital. And in some ways, what Charles said about what Chuck said, which is very interesting, is that limitations do enhance creativity, I think. I mean, when you start from that. When you work on a film, you have a kind of a severe set of limitations sometimes in how much work, what your assignment is. It's very specific. And the creativity blooms from within that. But the difference in tools, it does have an effect. I mean, I think I enjoy drawing digitally, but there's something about, and I think if Chuck were here, he would say this, I'm pretty sure, working with the old analog with the feel, the resistance of paper. And I love Blackwing pencils. I have a blog that's named after them for that reason. I love the pencil, and you know, just it's a very organic thing, obviously.
That's what I was going to ask you about. Is drawing with a pencil is in some ways a very sensual experience, that you feel the resistance and the tooth of the paper and the thickness of the point as your hand moves. Does a Cintiq capture that same sensuality?
Actually, it does come close sometimes, surprisingly. I mean, if it didn't, it would be really a chore. It would not be any fun at all. It was really fun when we started doing it around 06, 07, because it has a very sinuous line and it's immediate. But the things that are interesting about it is there's a little button. We use Photoshop usually when we're drawing. We do the drawings in Photoshop, then they get assembled just like that wall over there is drawings, that you can look at digitally. There's an undo button, And when I started using the Cintiq, and I was in love with it, we were all in love with it. We were all dazzled by this new technology that we saw at SIGGRAPH. And I found it when at home. I didn't have a Cintiq, and I'm drawing with my Blackwing on paper, and I would reflexively want to hit for the undo button, which kind of terrified me, I mean, and, so anyway, that's another great advantage of an actual materials, that you commit. You cannot change everything. And when I do my own drawings on a Cintiq, I try to make a point of not erasing and redoing it and kind of sticking with what I've got, so that I commit. Because you don't want to, endlessly fiddling. It's like having 1,000 sheets of paper,
No. I'm distracted by many things. What are we talking about?
Should I sit?
No, okay.
Should I sit farther away?
No, that's fine. You're doing great. I'm distracted, so when I work on a piece of music, especially if I'm using a computer, I find myself working in the program where I'm recording something, and then, boom, you have an email. And I go to the email. I'm like, oh, this is great. Oh, yeah, I read that, and I go back to the song, and I'm like, oh, where was I? And then, you have a text. And I'm like, over there. And then another email comes in, and it's this process that's so distracted that sometimes for me, and that's specifically just to me, I can't focus the creative mind to just focus on what's the task at hand. So I have always been one to use the analog pencil to the paper, sitting at the piano, and it's always been interesting because inevitably, when you erase, and you no undo button, right? Or Apple Z, right? Or whatever it is. The little eraser scribblies fall on the keyboard. So you end up ding, 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 ding. Oh, that's nice. Ding, ding, ding. And you're like, oh, maybe I'll put a 9 on that. So it's interesting how the actual, you never know, an eraser thingy could fall on there, and all of a sudden you're playing a C minor 7 opposed to a 9, because it's there. But my biggest thing is always just trying to connect and stay as focused as possible. And when I'm with the pencil, with the paper, just with the piano, isolated, not distracted by other things around me, that seems to be my easiest way to get what needs to get on the paper.
And now you know why his next album will be entitled Shavings.
So on point you are.
Well, as a manufacturer of pencils, do you have to do like pencils and then somehow stuff them into your iPhone?
Well, I use an iPhone, of course. I think we all have our technology that we use, and in my office, I'm at the computer a good bit of the day. But as Christian mentions, there's a lot of distractions with that, and I find when I want to think seriously about some of the projects we're doing, thinking about planning a project like this, or an event like this, or a strategy for how do we bring something like the Blackwing pencil back? How do we create energy in a very unique experience around using a pencil or a feeling? And I think that I take a lot of my notes. I work almost exclusively in pencil. I have some pens, but if I have to sign a check, I'll
Speaking
use a
of
pen.
which,
I don't think they accept graphite on.
I think there are 4 checks you have to sign tonight.
But I think one of the things whether it's graphite or ink or a color pencil or a paintbrush, one of the things I think when we talked about the sensile tactile sensation when you are writing or drawing, or anytime you're putting something to paper. Paper has a texture, and there's many different types of papers, and there's many different types of writing instruments or artistic instruments, from paintbrushes to pencils to pens to markers, and you're actually physically depositing a material to another material, and I think there's a sensation, there's a connection that goes right to the brain as you're doing those activities. You can't quite get that working digitally.
Well, apropos of that, some of the most beautiful animated films of the last couple decades are those of Frederick Bach, the great French-Canadian ecologist filmmaker, and he found his voice as an animator when he began drawing in colored pencil on frosted cells that had just enough tooth to take the color, and he could create anything in that from a monochromatic image to what looks like an impressionist canvas in motion. But he said he had to animate in pencil on the cells, that if he was working on paper, it didn't feel right and he couldn't do it. Another problem, though, that our increasingly digital world brings, Craig, that I would expect you to be aware of, is there's much less of a record in some ways, that we can look at Chuck's sketches and his rough drawings. We can see Charles Dickens' manuscripts, or heaven help you, Proust's notebooks with their infinite pastings into them. That's a legacy that we have. That how do we keep that alive in this era? And would you know as much about your grandfather and his work if you didn't have those artifacts?
I don't think we'd be sitting here right now in this space if we didn't have those artifacts. I mean, thank goodness for my mother and my grandfather keeping many of those artifacts so that we can display them. But going back to your question about the tools, and certainly, as Jenny was talking about, what would Chuck say? And first of all, a ChuckTalk, that's brilliant. That came out, I'm sure, someone's hand, holding onto a Blackwing like Chuck did, and going, what could we call this talk about creativity? I mean, there should be ChuckTalks on every corner, or anytime more than one person gets together, and let's have a ChuckTalk. However, remembering Chuck with his Blackwing pencil and his pads of paper sitting there, even when I was a kid, and any time that he had a thought, or whether it was a spiral notebook or something, it would just go on to that paper. And there were all kinds of papers strewn all over the place, whether he was working or whether he was thinking or traveling. And he would use another utensil if there was nothing else there. But I remember one time when my elder son was very young and was going to do a drawing. Chuck was going to do a drawing for him, and he said, "Oh, wait, let's use a pen so it'll last longer." And my mother reached over and said, "Graphite has been around for thousands of years, and it will never fade. So get your pencil and give it to your grandfather." However, so his certainly his medium was paper and pencil. That was certainly what he loved to do. And I'm a computer engineer by training, and certainly my first career was in computer engineering. And so I'm very digitally minded, and I love the digital side of things. But I find myself, over the last 15 years, carrying around, I'm now on my, I think, 38th volume of my laboratory notebook, that I take all my notes in. I write every letter, basically, that I'm going to write in that notebook first, because there's something about the process, even of writing it down. When I'm on the computer, if I'm backspacing, I'm worried about the email coming in, even if I turn it all off. The backspacing, it's got to be here, and then the little caret that goes in, where you're dropping in and you're dropping in a phrase, and you're and by the end of it, it's a scribbly mess, but all the thoughts are sitting down there. And I look at that in Chuck's notebooks, where he crossed out things, put things, he'd go for a speech, and all of the notes that he'd make. That's all part of the history that you'd never get. Like you said, if none of that paper and pencil were there for us to review to find out how he thought, I think that's just a part of history that we would lose.
That also brings up, when you were talking about him drawing for your son, I remember meeting Chuck for lunch or brunch at the Four Crowns. Was it the Four Crowns?
The Five Crowns.
5 Crowns. I'm short a crown.
Back then.
Yeah.
Now we're 5.
This is a long time ago, and of course, all the waiters and waitresses and the guests would always get a drawing from Chuck. That would be he had a little sort of half size, about a storyboard pad size, that he always seemed to have with him, and a couple of Blackwings, and all his admirers, he would always just knock out a drawing for of Wiley or Bugs Bunny, and you can't do that digitally.
If no paper, it would be on the tablecloth or on the napkin. More napkins exist in private collections with Chuck Jones drawings than probably anybody else.
I gotta say, my musicians on tour lose their music. It's my music. Their music, whenever it's printed. So whenever I have it in computer form, they're just like, well, just print another one. But whenever I give them something that I've sketched out, they're like, oh, yeah, let me take good care of this. I don't want to, you spent a lot of time on this. It's like, yeah, that's the one,
now.
Don't freaking lose that. And so, when I think about the importance of that, it's like, wow, people take something seriously when they see when it's on paper, yeah.
Charles, I remember years ago there was a Peanuts cartoon where Charlie Brown said, oh, I have to go sharpen my pencil, I broke the point, and the lead's broken. And Linus looked at him and said, well, it's not lead anymore, it's a combination of Madagascar graphite and Bavarian clay. And Charlie Brown said, you're the only person I know who can take all the joy out of sharpening a pencil. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about, we all use pencils, but how are they? How do you get that little thing in the middle of them? And what is it really? I mean, it's not lead anymore. No, the EPA wouldn't let us do that. But how does it work?
No, it hasn't been lead for many hundreds and years. And graphite and clay, that's basically what it is. Sometimes it's not so much Bavarian clay or Madagascar graphite. They've found graphite deposits all over, but the method to produce, originally graphite was just found as raw deposits. It was carved right out of a stone. People used it for marking their sheep to keep track of their property, identify their sheep versus somebody else's sheep. And one of the things about graphite, it is a little messy, so they started wrapping it in string. So the first pencils that were using graphite were slices of slivers of just pure graphite being wrapped in string. And eventually they came up with the wood case pencil, and to case it in wood, to protect it, to sharpen it, and all that. And so there's the quality of the raw materials, certainly varies all over the world. There's pencils being produced all over the world. The cedar that we use for the Blackwing has been the premier species of wood for the highest quality pencils all over the world for about 100 years now. We started coming in around 1910, 11 or so, where the first incense cedar was used. Prior to that, western or eastern red cedar was used, Juniperus virginiana, and probably taking all the joy out of this right now.
No, but I was going to say, one thing I like about Blackwings is they have that flat eraser,
exactly.
So the cat won't take it. Regular number 2 pencils suddenly disappear from the table and turn up on the floor in odd places. And you can't do that with a Blackwing, I'm happy to say.
Yeah, unless you're on a ship and it's listing pretty heavily, I guess. But then it might just slide instead of roll. I don't know.
But then you don't have the cat to deal with.
Exactly.
And
I wanted to comment on one thing about, God bless technology for the archival copying skills. 100 years ago, we didn't even have carbon copy. And one of the big products in the pencil industry, and we have some samples in our historical exhibit over here, was copying pencil. There was a specific pencil made called a copying pencil by many different manufacturers. Every company had them. And it was used over tracing paper, and this was how things were copied. This is how you made your, before the Xerox, before the,
Well, no, and
the copy.
that was a problem even later than that. I'm
Right.
reading right now a book about the woman who helped to decipher the ancient Cretan script.
Right.
And even after World War II, she had to copy everything in pencil because you couldn't very well, how else could you copy something from a clay tablet or a photograph of a clay tablet?
Right. So they would trace right over. It's very detailed,
yeah,
very detailed work. Of course, archival work, you can't go into an archive generally and use a pen. They're verboten. I mean, don't want to be spilling any ink on, precious documents. So pencils are, still very much used there, and they're used for education and many other ways. And a lot of people seem to think that pencils are dying, but the market continues to grow more or less the rate of world population growth. So every year there's 1 or 2% growth in the pencil industry.
Well, and besides, doing a crossword puzzle in pen is just asking the gods to strike you down for hubris. I'm curious, Jenny, as you're the one of us who draws, what sort of inspiration do you take from other artists' drawings, whether they're story artists or animators, and do you see, like, are you looking at the line or the stroke of somebody like Bill Pete's storyboards or the animation drawings from the Warner's artists? When you look at those, you probably see things in a way that the rest of us don't.
I don't know if I might analyze it a bit more, but I suspect it kind of affects everybody in the same way. You mentioned Bill Pete or Chuck's drawings, or anybody whose animation drawings you see, Freddie Moore's drawings, who often used a red pencil or a blue pencil underneath. You love the line. For artists I admire, I love the line quality, but I never just look at the line quality. It's always the final product. Chuck or Ken Harris's or so many guys' drawings of Bugs Bunny, for instance. It's the entire drawing has the personality in it and the acting in it, and the line quality is definitely part of that. I mean, you can feel. It's a strange thing to describe, but it's sort of like seeing a dance there on the paper that comes together as a complete personality, a complete thing. It's never abstracted. I mean, I worked with Maurice Noble, who also drew, and he would always say, I don't draw, but when I worked with him, his eyesight was very bad, but he would get a big blunt pencil and get this close to the paper and draw layouts. He was a layout artist, so he would design the backgrounds for most of Chuck's great cartoons.
Yeah.
And those, again, they were backgrounds. They were, settings, like What's Opera Dock or a forest or something fantastical. But they were alive. They had a personality of their own because of the way he put the pencil on the paper. I think that's true of any artist that I admire, any animation artist or fine artist. And it's funny about the pencil and where it's going. I was thinking as we were talking about technology taking over, the funny thing to me is that I suspect, there's kind of an arts and crafty movement, obviously, that's come up of late with people in their early 20s, through mid-20s and even younger. And I see the drawing being that way. I mean, I think it's gone in a more fine art direction because it's become more precious and rare. There are quite a few fine artists who work just in the drawing medium. I don't know if they work with Blackwings, they should, but...
We're trying.
But no, what you were saying before about Maurice Noble with the big soft pencil, I don't think anyone likes softer pencils than Glenn Keane, one of the great animators of all time. And you would go and see Glenn when he was working on something, and Eric Goldberg caricatured him as the chimney sweep in Mary Poppins because he would just be covered in graphite. He looked like he'd been working in a coal mine. I'm curious, though, do you also, we talk about looking at the rough drawings of something. Do you also see the equivalent in musical scores? Can you see Mozart pencil annotations and changing things, or a Dave Brubeck chart? Is he making little emendations and erasures?
Yeah, I think when I look at, and I've had the opportunity to see some really wonderful scores, which are either in pencil or in ink or however they're preserved. For me, whenever I'm writing something, especially if it's like a dynamic marking or something that really is more of a design aspect to music, because we have our little notes, you know. But then we have our dynamics, which are indicated through these different kind of slashes and marks that are big or small. There's something about drawing that crescendo or drawing that decrescendo that when it's funny, if you look at when I write it, I don't know if this is good or bad, but when I write something that's going to be a big crescendo, it gets very dark. When I write it, very dark and very thick, and I kind of go over it a couple times. You know, it's a very intense thing. And then when it gets lighter and lighter, as the song gets lighter, as the part of that song starts to get quieter, all of a sudden the notes and everything in that part of the song start to get harder to read.
So then say,
I think it's a direct, I think it's a direct thing. For me, you know, I'm not an artist, so the art is in the music, but the small amount of art that I'm doing and drawing this notation carries, in my opinion, through what is actually then represented on the page, kind of an artistic.
So then say a Wagner score would be in a number 1 pencil, and Chopin would be in about a 9.
A 22, yeah, exactly. And in jazz, you know, good grief, there's the melody, and then there's all the bars for, you know, the form for everybody to improvise, and lots of hash marks. So it's a hell of a thing, yeah.
Greg, Jenny was talking about how, you know, drawing is coming back, and there's a bit more of an artisanal push in things. Something I know, of course, that Chuck created this foundation for was for arts education. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit to that and why you're involved in it and the need for it in today's educational system, with the rest of you chiming in, as I believe you're all involved in various, you know, educational things to some degree.
You know, it's a bit intimidating at times coming around and being around such brilliant artists. I mean, I'm not an artist. I'm a technology guy that got dumped into an area surrounded by brilliance and all creative people. And then about 15, 18 years ago, it was actually, I guess it was about 15 years ago, that my mother and Chuck and I got an idea that there was this brilliance, this inspiration that somehow Chuck's work, maybe not uniquely, but certainly had an effect and on people who saw it. Not just his animation, his artwork, his drawing, his speaking, his writing, and that there was something percolating in all of us that we wanted to continue to bring on into the future. And it was about 10 years ago, right after Chuck had passed away, within the maybe 6 months afterwards, that we got together, and the Chuck Jones Foundation, we thought, you know, that's pretty generic. First of all, maybe people don't know who Chuck Jones is. The basic research is there's only about 5 or 6% of the planet that probably know his name. However, there's about, you know, 30 or 40% who know Bugs Bunny and many of the characters. So when we sat down and we went, you know, let's distill down what Chuck's about. Is it animation? Is it drawing? Is it something? And we kept coming around it in so many ways, and the word creative kept popping up. And it's so separate from any certain genre or any certain discipline that creativity exists in everything we do. And so the whole idea behind the Chuck Jones Center for Creativity is to inspire and to ignite that spark that exists, that creative genius, that creative juice inside each one of us that comes out in a unique way, whether it be in writing or animation or, you know, proliferating great tools and bringing things to the world, certainly in music. But in Chuck's world, it was also about inspiring science and education and medicine and all these different disciplines. These people would come into shows and talk about how they were inspired to be better at disabling a nuclear device. Literally. That was a conversation that was had near Los Alamos Labs. And I figured that if somebody needs to be inspired, it's a guy who needs to disable a nuclear device. So I figure that what we are doing with the Center for Creativity actually is saving the world. One nuclear device at a time. So, the way I see it.
All I can say to that is imagine Wile E. Coyote doing that.
These are not Acme products we are working with. Yes. However, that is, as far as our educational programs, every time we turn around, yes, there's an absolute need, and we sit and we step back and go, you know what, there's a solution for this need. And that all of a sudden, great partnerships and great people, I just met Charles a little over a year ago, and all of a sudden we're like best friends. Love his wife, Ginger. And all of
he
a sudden,
promises he'll give me back that $50 too.
So, literally we are finding ways to inspire that creative genius in so many different ways, and all of a sudden, and I give the credit where it's due, because Chuck's work and Chuck's life and Chuck's contribution to the world is a magnet for now 6 generations. And really what we feel as a family and all those people that work with us is that it's our responsibility to take that opportunity and turn it into something that continues to inspire.
Well, I have to say to that Chuck was a great encourager of young talent, and I was one of the people he encouraged. When my first long article about animation ran in the LA Times, I was in film school, and the next day I walked into the animation workshop at UCLA, and there was a note on the board, Charles, Chuck Jones wants you to call him, and a number. And once they took the defibrillator off and I was breathing normally, I called him and went to see him, and he had liked the article and felt I had something to say about animation. And thereafter, I was expected to report in regularly and talk about what was happening in animation with him. And if somebody wrote something unkind about me in a letter to the editor, he would fire off a vicious rebuttal. And it was something I'm not sure what I did to deserve, but have always been grateful for. And that's one reason I do teach now, to try and pass on some of what he gave me. So, that's a personal note, but I'd like the others now to talk about their educational work and why you do it and thoughts on it.
If I can add just one thing, you said something about how gracious Chuck was. We just literally, based upon the event last night, one of the tweets on the Blackwing experience and Chuck Jones reached Seattle, Washington, and a friend sent to another friend said that my granddad worked with Chuck in the 1940s. During the strike, my dad was out on the picket line and was arrested for picketing. Her grandmother was going into labor, and Chuck took her to the hospital so that her father could be born. Said, I owe my life to your grandfather. So I figured that, yes, just another story as of today because of this that we found out about that.
So do you have something a little less dramatic to offer?
Let's see. Well, I also have a grandfather named Charles. I don't think anybody would ever dare to have called him Chuck, but he was a scientist, and he spent and devoted his life to improving the technology with which our products were produced, and looking down at the very last minute detail of the cellular structure of how wood reacts to being cut. And he took that approach not just to his business in his work, but also in how he approached people. And he was a very big supporter of youth, and he was always very involved in young people. He helped many people. That he'd meet a person in Japan on a train station on the way to climb Mount Fuji and strike up a conversation. He spoke 7 languages, and he out of that would come a relationship communicating. He ended up bringing that person to the United States, paying for their education. And this is one of many stories. This happened with somebody in Italy during the war, the son of a Italian engineer that he helped out, and who eventually came to work, went to the States for his engineering degree, went to work in the pencil industry with one of our customers, and came back to our family and became almost another son to him. And there's stories right and left about this. He supported a lot of people. He was a big supporter of science education, but he was also of an artist of sorts. He loved to play waltzes on the piano, and his example, I think, has been followed by our family. We've always been big supporters of education. My father had a big bent for music. He plays piano. In fact, it's through it's through my father. He might, well, not like Christian, of course.
Be nice.
But, it's through my father that I met Christian, actually. But he's been a big supporter of the Brubeck Institute, so we've been involved with them. And as we've gone through the process of bringing back the Blackwing and just a lot of the things that we've been looking at, how pencils are used, Ginger and I have thought more and more. We look at what's going on out there, and more of our children. Our children are our future, and they're being judged on these crazy tests that don't always reflect what's important in life. When you are engaged in arts, whether it's music, whether it's drawing, you're using a part of your brain, you're learning tools, you're learning creativity. And if it's not for the creativity of our youth in the future, how are we going to advance as a society? How are we going to solve our problems? How are we going to learn how to collaborate and work with others like we do when, if you're a musician and you're playing in a group, you have to be in sync with others. So all these are skills life skills that are very important. So Ginger and I thought that this was very important, and so we've dedicated our time and energy and trying to work with great people, and it's been a great partnership to work with Craig, and we're reaching out to other organizations now, and Christian we've been able to fortunate to support Christian in his concept for Ignite the Arts, and
of course, may I point out, your family has probably taught everyone here how to write, because we all began with big soft pencils on paper with chunks of wood in it with blue lines. And one of the things I used to, when they had it, was to judge the LA Film Teachers Festival, because like the kindergarten through grade 3 films were wonderful, but they knew about credits even at that age, and they would be written in soft pencil on that same paper with the blue lines, and things like producer and director would be misspelled, but they were writing them.
Well, I guess that's what if anything we do with what we do as a company, we're helping facilitate communication and self-expression, and that's what creativity really is.
Yeah. I think for me, Charles was talking a bit about Ignite the Arts, and I remember being in 6th grade and being distracted. I'm still distracted, if that's okay. Not really having a clear vision of what I wanted to do. And my mom said, Christian, you should get into a group. You should get into some sort of group activity. And and there was the basketball team, the baseball team, the soccer team, and there's band. She pushed me in band. Sometimes I curse that, but sometimes not. I remember getting into band and not really having a clear vision of what I wanted to do, what I wanted to play. And I remember that first day in class, the band director said, I'd like to bring in a professional musician to come in and perform for you, because we've been practicing scales, we've been practicing all the kind of the mechanics of how to make music. And in 7th grade, most band classes don't sound anything like music, and so it's a little hard to see the light at the end of the tunnel when everybody's just like blah, splash. So I remember, kind of being interested in percussion and piano, and they brought in this instructor, or this professional, and he came in and he had brought in a 7-foot-long grand marimba, and he played this amazing music. He played Flight of the Bumblebee. And I was like, oh my gosh, that is amazing. I want to do that. I want to be like that. That guy is amazing. And I said, that's what I want to do. And it was that connection between where I was here and where I wanted to be. And what I feel is today, and being a professional musician and having a passion for music, and specifically jazz music that's kind of fallen out of the popular music songbook, audience members always say, oh, you know, the kids today, they don't appreciate the great standards. And they sound just like that. And it's because my audience is really old. Exactly. So, right, exactly. And I was a boy. And so I say, you know, the interesting thing is it's not that children don't appreciate the music of before, the classical music, opera, jazz, the Great American Songbook, where it came from. It's because they haven't been exposed to it. They haven't had the opportunity to form an opinion about it. I have no problem if somebody doesn't like jazz. My mother doesn't like jazz. That's okay. She's like, oh, the notes, too many notes. And so, fine, if you have an opinion about it, great. But what I feel our opportunity is for what we do, taking our passions, whether it's through the foundation of drawing and animation, or if it's through music, or however it is, and having that opportunity to go in and give them that ability to have an opinion and see what it could be, then let them make their own decision, and then from there it's on there. But for me, that's what I see the benefit of a program of going in, showing them what it can be, and hopefully inspiring them to keep going at it, keep driving at it.
Jenny?
Wow, it's impossible to follow those acts. That's so inspiring. I've gone through about 5 different things I was going to say, but one of them I was just thinking of was some years ago, there was a kind of an industry-wide thing that was done the year I was involved with it at the Fox Studios, where different studios, Film Roman does The Simpsons, and Warner Brothers, and Disney, and they all sent artists to this sort of art fair that was held on the lot, and they invited inner-city kids to come out, and the idea was you're going to sit there and draw for them. Now, I draw for myself, I draw for my work. I'm one of the world's worst. Although I'm an artist and I've been doing it for 20 years, I can't stand being asked, do me a drawing, because I immediately get stage fright about it, which seems weird, but that's, just the way it is. If anybody's watching, I freeze up. But I volunteered for this thing, I was going to do it, and I went, and when I got to the lot and I parked my car, I almost just drove out. I had such terrible stage fright, I'm not going to be able to do this. How am I going to be able to draw an order for these guys, And of course, I worked for Warner Brothers, they were all going to want Bugs Bunny, and I was going to do the world's worst Bugs Bunnies, on the spot. I wasn't going to be able to do it. The standards are too high, right? So, and this was going to be an all-afternoon thing. So we had our little booth, and there were guys there working on the Batman, Bruce Timm, and these guys who were all hot shots who do these action heroes. That ain't my thing, So I was going to do the bunnies, the rabbits, right, and the pigs. And once I sat down, and I mean, it was for kids, but a lot of these kids looked very adult. I mean, they were mature young men, mostly young men, actually very few young women as I remember it, and they were intimidating. And they were guys that would intimidate me out on the street, and they were from places I've probably never been in LA. And they came up in groups around our booth, and it was the biggest blast I've ever had. And once I started drawing for these guys, and they'd say, can you draw Bugs Bunny with his girlfriend? And at that point, Bugs Bunny didn't have a girlfriend. This is before Space Jam or any of that stuff. And then they'd start kind of shyly talking, go, I like to draw, and well, do you? And I mean, we just started this conversation, and the communication of the drawings took away any barriers or anything that we have between us in our lifestyles or our age or anything else. And it was just about that drawing and the love of those characters, that everybody loved. The Warner Brothers characters, it was really revelatory to me, and that 4 or 5 hour afternoon went by in about 20 seconds. I couldn't believe it. I mean, they had to pull me out of the chair, all of us, when we were done, and it really struck me. And I thought, I thought about these guys that I talked to, and the ones who said they like to draw, and I said, you got to do it, man, you got to do it, And I'm sure there's no arts programs in a lot of these schools. I mean, that's what we read, and I've read year after year after year, which really, obviously, is very concerning and dismays me. I went to public school in Los Angeles, and at that time we had 1 day a week, where an artist would come in and we'd do various things. I don't even know if that's available now, but it's so important, and even cartooning, even animation.
It's one of the challenges we had when we were doing Ignite the Arts was scheduling to go into these high schools around the country with the week that they would have band. And they're like, oh, we don't have band that week, or we only have it twice a month. And you're like, well, how are they supposed to go from sounding like blah to something really great when you only rehearse once a week? Or it was after school. And you start to go, well, that's why this is so important. This is why we have to do this. If it's not going to happen at the educational level within the institutions of the government workings of how those programs are funded, it's on us. And it's people like this that help facilitate that. And I think that's, like a program like that, you're absolutely right. Cuts all the barriers down. You go in there, you inspire these kids, and they leave. And then you turn on your technology and you have like 35 Facebook friends from all these kids who are like, we want to come see you draw, or we want to come see you play, or whatever it is. That's the thing that's really inspiring, is to see the end result of it, and it's so important.
Okay, well, we're going to need to wrap this up, or Craig will have to pay another day's rental on his jacket. But before we take questions from the audience, I'd like to tell you a story about another animator, Seamus Culhane, who worked for Chuck on Inky and the Mynah Bird. He worked on Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. He did the dwarves marching along the log on their way home. He was an animator all his life, but when he died, his family buried him with a Blackwing pencil in his hand rather than a rosary, because that had meant more to him ultimately.